Hello, and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Nour Joudah, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is Friday, January 31st, 2025, and I am honored to be here with Ahmad Gharbieh to discuss some of the most recent mapping projects at Beirut Urban Lab. Ahmed is Associate Professor and Convener of the Graphic Design Program at the School of Architecture and Design at the American University of Beirut. He's also co-founder of the Beirut Urban Lab, an interdisciplinary and collaborative research space where he leads the critical mapping, design, and research track. His scholarly work explores mapping as a method of researching, representing, and analyzing socio-spatial phenomena. His work in critical cartography has covered many subjects, including urban security and recovery, public space, refugee practices in the city, political violence, and much more. Today, Ahmed is joining us to speak about the work of the Beirut Urban Lab's critical mapping team, which has put together some incredible visualizations and studies, especially in the last year and a half during Israel's genocide in Gaza and its invasion of southern Lebanon and attacks on Beirut. Ahmed, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Noor. Happy to be with you.
So just to take a step back, my background is in geography. Obviously, this is very much also your specialty, but we are speaking to an audience that isn't necessarily steeped in cartography. Maybe you can share to start for our listeners a bit on the concept of critical cartography and how it's valuable to really understanding the spaces in which we live.
Sure. Let's start. Actually, you just mentioned that you're, a geographer by training, and in fact, academically at least, critical cartography came after a moment, in the 80s where human geography became, a very prominent perspective, right? Introduced to the field. And naturally, I would say, it really took hold in the mid to late 90s as what we call critical cartography today, these ideas of exposing the map as a socially constructed text, right? As a political instrument. And a big part of that is the understanding that maps have always been quintessential instruments of power. And, they are steeped in scientific epistemology and claims of objective truth, essentially passing on their distortions of the world, because let's be clear, all maps are reductionist, right? All maps are abstractions. They're all mere representations. And so they pass on these distortions as necessary, right?
We're so
The more
used to
direct
like
way, yeah, sorry, go
no,
ahead.
no, not at all. I was just gonna say, and we're so used to, and also like as a general audience, right? Before any of us, enter higher education or as children, etc., we're taught to understand maps as these very sort of like data-driven, fact-based images.
Exactly.
And it takes some time, and some folks never do, obviously, for us to even interrogate like our relationship with these images.
This is precisely the kind of realization that kind of fueled all of this, which started with a kind of an alternative history of cartography. So looking at the history of maps with that in mind, but also making maps in a different way, right? So a kind of more straightforward way of explaining this idea is thinking about this history, right? Which gave maps a certain believability, or this is exactly what you were talking about, a kind of an authority, let's say, that one unchecked can create really representations of territories and societies that become undisputed truths, right? So critical cartography essentially is about upending this myth of scientism and claims of objective truth. But it also has to do a lot with, I mean, part of that is questions about who is mapping, who gets to map, and what is being mapped or who is being mapped. And so the scientific cartographer, right? Interestingly enough, historically also the cartographer is an artist, right? So there's always like the art of map making, and there was always a lot of pride in the visual artistic, you know, kind of talent that is in cartographic practice. So there's a shift from the scientific cartographer towards, I would say, on the opposite end of the spectrum today, we can talk about the citizen mapper, right? With the available tools and with more open access technology, and visual literacy, generally speaking, right? So, and this is important as well to point out because cartographic literacy is important to always be aware of. And it's not, of course, something that we can consider to be equal in multiple contexts. There are, places in societies that have been using maps for longer, where these kinds of representations are more part of everyday life. Even when we think about everyday practices such as navigation, right? At what point did we ever in Beirut, for example, pick up a map to go somewhere? I mean, it's not necessarily, it's something that we do now, but it's something that in other places was happening on a more regular basis. So yeah, I mean, there are all of these issues that we can think about when we think about what critical cartography is really proposing. But essentially, it's really about kind of critiquing the map as you know, as a supposedly, unbiased, fact-driven representation of the world. And it's also important to think about how practicing critical cartography actually means taking decisions that perhaps embrace inaccuracies, gaps in the data, insert the positionality of the mapper in the text, and not hide behind some kind of, purely scientific method with a little bit of an artistic flair.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on that note, what about you personally? Like, how did you come to this field? And as we move into the conversation on Beirut Urban Lab specifically, and what started it, what is sort of your personal motivation and interest for working in the field of maps and in working on critical mapping particularly?
Honestly, I mean, I'm a trained graphic designer, and then I did urban sociology for my graduate studies. But it started from an interest in design, and there's something quite, as much as we want to be, and we should be critical of maps, there's something almost magical about their ability to condense information over time and space as well, in a way that can be communicated very effectively. So it started from that particular interest, and I've always had an interest in the urban in general, particularly growing up in Beirut, particularly the kind of informal urban landscape, and the vernacular that comes with that. And maps tend to be also maybe sometimes clinical in the way that they represent their data and or the phenomena that they're trying to describe. And I've always had this lingering question of how can I reconcile these two things? On the one hand, a kind of a fascination with a very organic reality that is like difficult to kind of trace and mark and measure. And at the same time, a fascination in these visualizations, which tend to be very precise and accurate and detailed and layered. Um, so that the question was, could I use these tools in order to make sense of these particular landscapes? And that's what I did in my like first thesis project in my undergraduate degree, where I was really interested in the Ozai Strip in South Beirut. And I produced a series of maps, and that was really where it started.
Yeah, I think there is something, now, so we're so used to, we have the phone in our pocket, we're so used to having, Google Maps or whatever particular app one, prefers or uses. The idea of kind of everything being mapped, like you said, in particular, cities in the region like Beirut, where, prior to a decade ago, no one thought to like pick up the phone in their, in their pocket and figure out where to turn to get to what place. You ask the guy on the corner, or because you're from there, and if you're not from there, someone's gonna like, هيدلك, someone's gonna tell you how to kind of get there.
Yeah.
And not to mention, of course, every cabbie in town knows how to get everywhere.
Yeah.
Um, and that's, I mean, there's so many aspects of this that have shifted from the, presence of rideshare to, uh, you know, uh, our ability to just kind of navigate ourselves places. And yet, like you said, there is still, for better or worse, this romance
Yeah.
to the map. Um, On that note, Beirut Urban Lab specifically, correct me if I'm wrong, starts around 2018. And I guess, one of I've kept track of its projects for years. I mean, some really incredible reports and visualizations.
Thank
Maybe
you.
you can share with our audience just a bit about how it started and what it seeks to do, or the need that it seeks to fill.
Sure. So, yes, the Beirut Urban Lab was officially institutionalized in 2018. Um, However, it would not be totally accurate to say that this is when it started. In fact, the four directors of the Beirut Urban Lab, that would be myself, Muna Fawaz, who is a planner, Muna Harib, who is a political scientist, and Huwaid Al-Harithi, who is an architecture historian, um, started collaborating back in 2006. And of course, this was in the aftermath of the 2006 military assault, Israeli military assault on Lebanon, otherwise known as the July War or the 33-day war. Um, and we, in individual capacities, but also in collaborations amongst each other, started reacting to the aftermath of 2006 by utilizing our knowledge, our interest, and in my case, obviously, interest in mapping, and to do different projects. One of them was the mapping of strikes of 2006, which really started my particular work on conflict. This is really where it all began, but also there was in the American University of Beirut, where we all worked in different capacities. I was still part-timing at that time, where I mean, there was a reconstruction unit that was founded right after the 2006 war to try to imagine new modalities of recovery for the devastated areas. I remember being part of the Har Tahrik project. Um, so this is how we kind of all started working together. And over the years, we really did multiple projects collaboratively on multiple subjects, including um, work on public space, work on securitization, work on leisurely places, faith-based leisurely places in also South Beirut, and refugee practices in the city. So we did multiple projects over the years until in 2018, we had an access to institutional fund that would allow us to really, set up the lab properly. But it was very much giving a kind of a formal, um, space or configuration to something that has been in the works for many years. And yeah, in 2018, the lab became what it is today.
And in the process of that sort of formalization under an institution, when when that happened, would you say was the main driving factor and or desire behind setting up this kind of lab on campus? And who are you trying to engage the most in its participation and in its projects to the public?
So there's multiple, let's say, aims, right, behind this endeavor. The more general is our dedication to social justice, and imagining more livable, equitable, fair cities. Um, and It's much more efficient, obviously, to have something institutionalized so that you can contribute to what we call this ecosystem of urban change, and be able to really, I mean, we call it a multidisciplinary research space, and to really be able to bring in all of these different disciplines, at least these four that I mentioned that are represented by the directors, in a way where we can feed into each other's know-how, learn from one another, work together more regularly and rigorously towards this goal. So obviously, a part of that is connecting to other networks of other researchers, other activists, the public at large, enthusiasts that are interested in similar concerns as us. And so having a space from which we can do that allowed us to do it much more efficiently. So this is one aspect of it. Another, I would say, is something which is perhaps a little specific to Beirut, but I'm pretty sure it's a condition of other contexts where we suffer from an extreme case of data scarcity, but also neglect and secrecy, right? I mean, think about the fact that the primary cartographic authority in Lebanon operates under the army, right? The Lebanese army. That should give you an idea of the kind of data secrecy that we have to deal with. And of course, living in Lebanon with its now very well-known failed state, and knowing that actually the lack of public data and the public access to whatever data is there is a little bit of a hallmark of its, of its inefficiency and failure. So this was another really big driver for us in the lab, which is to be able to source data, collect data, survey data, and make it available to a wider public in accessible, open, visualized form, as much as we can. And a lot of our projects are actually in service of this particular goal, and towards that particular aim. Another, I would say, is to be able to continue doing what we love to do. and have the structure that will open um, certain opportunities for us, funding, of course, being one of them. It's much more effective to
Of
be able
course,
to do that when you're not like an individual,
of course.
striving to get some support from here and there. And now we're like, we're like a solid um, uh, group that. I mean, and having the lab allows us to have like a very good record of what we do, and expose that to the public on a continuous basis.
Yeah, I mean, on this point of uh, public access to data and um, the public service component of not only giving access to that data, but doing so as you mentioned earlier, in the form of digestible visuals, right? And narratives alongside those visuals. I mean, one of the sort of hallmarks of so many of your projects is that you're not just kind of also throwing a map at people and expecting them to get whatever they need by just staring at it. There are interactive components. There's also often, written narratives kind of explicating out the research and conclusions of the data that's been mapped. And so on that note, maybe you can also, we can start to get into some of the specific projects, particularly the recent ones of the last year of the critical mapping team. You've done some incredible work tracking the herbicide in Gaza specifically. And we will link for those that are listening and not clicking on the website. We will link on the website to the projects that we're going to discuss today, so folks can also take a look, because to Ahmed's point, so much of this work is visual. Maybe you can share with us a bit on how the herbicide in Gaza sort of mapping and project begins, the process of data collection, what it's showing, and how it's continuing to be developed.
Sure. A little note first
Yeah, of
on
course.
attributing this work to the critical mapping team.
Mm,
Um, of course, this is the work of the critical mapping team. I'm not saying it's not. But this particular component of the work in the lab actually cuts across. It's a horizontal, really. It's a horizontal element that is becoming really today, I can very safely say, part of every project that the lab embarks on. There are some research projects that, can remain, I guess, mapping and data visualization free. But so my point being is that a lot of times the critical cartography work that is done for the, let's say, housing research track, or the heritage research track, or the governance research track, right? So it's pretty much a collaborative effort, but of course the mapping itself, the data analytics, the GIS work, the visualization, the design, the conceptualization of the maps and the digital platforms is very much the responsibility of our mapping team, which
Speaks to
which is core to
your
the lab.
Yeah, which speaks to your point earlier, right, of the lab not only being multi or interdisciplinary, but that it is this collaborative research space, and everybody is involved in every part of every report. So
Exactly.
100%, I really appreciate that clarification.
Exactly. That's really what we think makes what we do quite rich, and this is why we think it manages to get to the kind of level that it does get to, and have the kind of impact that it's been having. It's to go to the specific projects. You asked me about the Gaza platform, and I mean work, let's say, because the platform is really just one component of it in particular. So actually, the Gaza research if we are to talk about the three geographies of Gaza, West Bank, and Lebanon as being the three more recent research projects that started after the events of October 2023. Tracking the herbicide in Gaza came last. And for many reasons, one of them being that the interest, our question had to do very much with damage, and having access to damage data was not easy at all. And we had, other urgent questions regarding Lebanon and the West Bank that we managed to be able to address while sourcing mainly the data from ACLED, which if you want, we can talk about. But after producing the Lebanon escalation platform, and then after that, the settler colonial violence in the West Bank platform, which followed shortly after, it was very important for us to also focus on Gaza. And the work started by identifying ways in which we can get access to data, but also before that to set in place the building blocks that are necessary for this kind of work to be practically possible. And what that really meant was building an accurate, up-to-date digital base map of Gaza, which did not exist at the time. This work really meant that we had to cross-reference multiple sources, and these include like open mapping available data, such as OpenStreetMap, among others, and have access to digital images, like satellite images, that we can also use to verify that data. And that took a lot of work. That was actually the biggest part of the initial work. And we're very happy that now there is, through the Gaza platform, an up-to-date with all of the building footprints pre-October 2023. But also that's very important because our base map also is really detailed in terms of scale, right? So it goes down to the building footprint, which is something that is very rare and urgent in this case, but also quite technically demanding, right? Both in terms of putting it in place, but also in terms of operating a base map with this much detail, just speaking about bandwidth and internet connections and things like that, right? I mean, it's not an easy task, but it was necessary for us to be able to do the kind of damage tracking that we were doing. The second contribution really is one of them is what I mentioned, is being able to granulate the damage readings down to the building footprint level. Most of the damage data that we were seeing being published at that time, a lot of it using really innovative technologies and very interesting mapping methods, such as LiDAR, which became something that managed to produce data readings very quickly, and it was actually used by journalistic sources quite a lot. But it did not give a very precise reading of the damage that's measurable down to the detail that we wanted it to be. But of course, it was very effective because it's a kind of technology that operates in bad weather as opposed to like satellite imagery tracking, and can be done at night. And it had a lot of advantages. And of course, we also cross-reference our work with all of these different works. We're in conversation with these different groups and labs that are producing these kinds of mappings. But we really wanted to give a detailed, layered, and also conceptually informed uh, stratification of the data. So it wasn't just about damage, it was about what does this damage mean. And for us, it meant the creation of these different layers of damage that we break down into infrastructure, institutional damage, building damage, damage of green spaces and open areas, heritage, and of course, also we try through our people and places sub-platform, right? I mean, output within this bigger platform to also give more anecdotal evidence, let's say, of damage, loss, destruction, herbicide, right? So it really works across multiple scales. It navigates across multiple layers of information, and paints a very detailed picture of herbicide, what we're calling herbicide, which of course is a term that encompasses much more than the damage of physical space and material loss.
Um, for you or others who were a part of putting this together, as you mentioned, it's a large team. There's also a lot of conceptual work that goes into this. What were some of the, I don't even know, I'm sure I know how to phrase this. What were some of the sort of most visceral reactions to actually, as you put these platforms together, as you create these layers, to realizing the extent of what you were mapping?
I would say really the extent of damage that is seen over time. I mean, we talked earlier about the ability of maps to kind of collapse time and space in a very, um, I guess, small form, right? Um, it's this interesting relationship of minimum ink, maximum data, right? I mean, maps really can do that very, very well when designed properly. Um, so, so yes, I mean, at least in the Gaza case, seeing the extent of damage over time in one snapshot
Yeah.
can be quite overwhelming. Um, but I'm not really sure how much more it does than what we've been seeing really day in and day out on our screens. So, I mean, there's something about maps as much as we try to, I mean, I mentioned earlier the people and places part of the mapping, but um, and it's something that of course we try to avoid, but there's something quite dehumanizing about cartography. Early critical cartographers would always use the example of how maps, the utility of maps was um, very much visible in military operations, and this kind of picture of someone looking at a map that's empty of people, and it essentially enables the act of killing, right, more easily. So as much as you can show the extent of damage on a map, as much as overwhelming that could be and can solicit really visceral reactions from the public, it is only, I think, complementary to the um, to the visual mediation of this conflict that we've been really I mean that's been quite you know it's been quite I don't know what word to describe really anymore. I mean it's of course shocking, right? But also over time, as we all know, we became all a bit desynthesized to that. So to circle back to the map, perhaps at least the map does not lose that effect over time. And there's something maybe to be said about that.
Bit of preservation of the devastation itself, even as some individuals, certainly not all of us, are able to uh, quote unquote move on, whatever that may mean for a particular population. One of the projects, and I'm not sure whether we should call it a report or a narrative mapping, etc., but that I found particularly poignant was the Echoes of War
Right.
work on Hamra. And to your point, because, questions around displacement or even voluntary movement around a city, even if it's not necessarily questions of forced displacement, um, are very difficult, right, to capture in just a visual sense and get the impact of what's actually moving these populations and the experience of the movement for those involved. The Echoes of War sort of page and work is incredible in the sense that it is able to convey some of that in narrative form in addition to whatever visuals are sort of attached. And for our listeners who are perhaps maybe have never been to Beirut, we don't have to do a whole history of Hamra, but if you can give them a sense of this as an example, right, of work about this particular neighborhood in Beirut, which is obviously has an incredibly rich history, and what's been happening recently and drove the lab to do this work, I think may be a great example of that kind of balance that you were referencing between sort of trying to give right the public this conceptualization work and visual work paired together.
Sure. I do have to admit first that this is a project that I wasn't too involved in. So forgive me if I'm not going to be able to give you too many insights
Oh,
on
no,
this
that's
particular
okay.
case. It is, however, representative of as an output form. It is very representative of multiple projects that we do at the lab. So the idea of a narrative that is the narrative form in order to kind of weave in visual material, testimonials, reflections together to really kind of provide a particular, I guess in this case, a certain ethnography of Hamra, but specifically when it comes to the latest displacement situation that happened. Yeah, I mean, I would say it has to do very much with the fact that it works because it allows the user to really see the story in multiple ways. Oftentimes, these story maps can, in fact, be grasps, let's say, through a very complex map that comes within that, multimedia output. Um, but also at the same time be able to see what that means in terms of an effect on a certain situation, to be able to or person, or to be able to move between the macro and the micro. And it also is just a very, I mean, I'm not going to use the word entertaining, but I would say it's a varied, right? I mean, going through a story map allows you to switch between photo, text, data representation, a diagram, something that is more of a geographic visualization. So there's something about that which is proving to be very popular and shareable. which is, of course, another important aspect of this kind of work, which is its shareability and also it's a little bit more accessible, I would say, to a wider public. So it gives you multiple ways in which you can enter that discourse and understand it and relate to it. And the work in Hamra is particularly interesting because of the, I mean, what happened, the different modalities of displacement that took place in that very short period found themselves coming together in Hamra in a very small space. So, and for us also, Hamra is always a very kind of ready, uh, uh, you know, area to study. It's very, I mean, AUB is in Hamra. And we all know it very, very well. And it allows us easy access, easy surveying. We have a network of people that we already know that is established. So if we ever want to make a point about something that is taking place in multiple localities, but we know has a certain manifestation in Hamra, it's our go-to context to kind of explore. And it was a very particularly interesting case in this situation because of the political parties that are operating in Hamra, that are always there, they're always visible, but their power is often kind of, unexposed. It's not very much, apart from the couple of flags that you see, the couple of like party offices. It takes situations like these where, the real instrumental power that these political parties have in the neighborhood comes to the forefront.
Just
And it was important for us to also show how much there is this kind of, I mean, how multiple actors were operating in order to, quote unquote, manage the displacement situation in Hamra. A lot of it informal, a lot of it also hard to track and trace. But through this output, we try to give this, these multiple facets to that story, and collapse them together in one space.
just for our for the audience who maybe won't have or won't be able to aren't looking at this via the website again to click on this report as readily and to sort of contextualize this, if you could you talk about these various modalities of displacement, if you could name some of them and maybe we can also contextualize the time period that we're talking about,
Yeah.
that I think that would be really helpful as well.
So we're talking about end of September 2024. This is really when the Israeli army started its campaign across all of Lebanon, of course, with a particular focus on the southern suburb, and expanded its assault in the south beyond the kind of, um, I don't know, I guess, agreed upon, right? There was a sort of an agreement that this is the limit of what we're doing, so that's not considered an escalation. And of course, none of this is formalized, but if it was a kind of an understanding. So obviously, at the end of September, Israel declared war on all of Lebanon, and the displacement rate amplified a lot. And this happened up until really the ceasefire, which came into effect in December, I think early December. So yeah, the exact date escapes me right now, but this is something anybody could look up. The different modalities that we're talking about are, well, on the one hand, you have your government-run shelters. They're the government-designated shelters. And these were mainly public schools that were identified and, became designated shelters. There's a lot that one can unpack within this particular this particular, I guess, sheltering of the displaced. A couple of things that I would mention is that it was mainly for Lebanese citizens. Syrian citizens were not allowed in. Migrant workers, other migrant workers were not allowed in. So of course it created an extremely dire situation for a lot of displaced people, families, individuals. And maybe that's a segue to like another modality, which is more, I guess, informal. And then you started having all of these ad hoc types of sheltering services, spaces that were either operated by individuals who were concerned or NGOs who had access and capabilities that specifically aimed at sheltering those who were not accepted in the government designated shelters. And there was also something which was, your typical informal taking over a vacant building type of occupation. A lot of time also facilitated by these political parties. So really the Hizb al-Missouri, the Social Nationalist Syrian Party, and Amal, who are, of course, allies, for lack of a better term, or at least they kind of, coordinate quite extensively, specifically in the Hamra neighborhood. So with that came, of course, control of these informal taking over of places. So you would have people being taken out of certain buildings if they were not part of that network, or if they don't have what we call in Lebanon wasta, right? So this ability to know someone who knows someone or have access to someone who knows someone. And yeah, so it's all of these different really things taking place at the same time that expose a lot about the state, that expose a lot about who has power in what neighborhoods. That exposes also a lot about discriminatory practices that happen day in and day out in Lebanon, in Beirut, which of course situations like this expose more flagrantly.
Yeah, and I think for me, that's the part that resonates with whether it's the herbicide in Gaza, sort of more direct visual mapping, or the narrative of the Echoes of War project, which is for Hamra, which is that, to your point earlier in our conversation on uncritical cartography, there is no space in which power does not operate. And so if we're mapping a space, how we try or avoid, some actors obviously, reflecting that power, right? Or telling the story of the way that power moves or tries to hide itself, is such an important part of whether you call it countermapping or critical mapping, of this kind of work. And, it's interesting. I have seen, we have seen such an explosion of this kind of work, not only in human geography and the particularities of our fields of urban planning, to your point, or architecture, or political science, graphic design, even to sort of the fields of the directors of Beirut Urban Lab, but even the larger public. I mean, way outside of kind of the academic realm, our ability to uh, process this kind of information, and our visual literacy has increased in some ways so much, and decreased in others, and our
Yeah.
ability to kind of be manipulated by it, by certain actors. But the the degree, I think, to which we have seen these kinds of mappings and visualizations be shared, in particular over the last several years, has been incredible, and has given us kind of a different way to talk about, so many various uh, moments of human movement, really, like around the planet, forced or otherwise.
Definitely. I mean, this is, a fast expanding field, and it's the interest in which is not only academic or even visual or artistic or, from a kind of a design point of view, but there is a public appetite for maps.
Absolutely.
This is and I would add to like the list of things that kind of emerged from that is also um, you know multiple forms of critical cartography. So
Mhm.
critical cartography is quite a, I mean,
Huge field, yeah.
we're still reckoning with that, right? I mean, we're
Oh, yeah.
still asking what's critical about critical cartography, right? So this is
Yeah.
this is something that we're continuously trying to define, and and with that comes really different, um, you know, I guess, different ways in which, let's call them cartographic practices.
Mhm.
So you mentioned countermapping, which tends to be specifically about, addressing dominant narratives, correcting certain hegemonic tropes, providing modes of resistance for those who are classically, don't have access to the tools of power, cartography being one of them.
Erased from maps completely,
Or
right? Indigenous
exactly,
populations
or
and
erased
others.
from maps altogether. Indigenous populations, of course, being the quintessential example of that.
Yeah.
In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, um, countermapping
Yes.
was coined in that particular
Yes,
context.
absolutely. It's absolutely 100% coined in the context of indigenous mapping. Yeah.
There you go. And we can expand on that, right? So there is, I mentioned earlier, citizen cartography. So this idea that everybody can have access to a tool now and can actually produce a map. Um, um, but also thinking about cartography in not so absolute terms. So in terms of, I don't know, ethnographic mapping,
Yeah.
narrative cartography,
Yes.
and also practices that have to do more or focus more on the question of who's doing the map. So collaborative um, map making, and other kind of collective, ways of producing maps and representations of geographic
And
representations and other.
to your point earlier, interrogating the map maker himself or herself, right?
Yeah.
The idea that we are also a part of the process and we put things into the map in the same way that we put something into a book that we write. Um, I wanna before I let you go, just kind of maybe transition us a bit for the end of the conversation and ask, so much of this work, to your point, has been and continues to be about transformation of neighborhoods or documenting destruction and violence, which there's a lot of potential in that work. There are limitations, as you've pointed out, to that work. Um, and I guess I just want to ask you whether it's this is an answer for the lab in general or for you personally. What do you hope that these stories and visualizations really provide for people, for the average person that clicks on the website or clicks on these projects? Um, what do you want that work to kind of do in the public sphere?
So there is the, the I guess the easy answer is that they contribute to a form of media activism, right? I mean, when it comes particularly to the conflict over the past year and a half, which of course is historical and it's much older, and it's not, if you talk to anybody from our region, for us, this is not something that is, new in any way. But we're used to dominant media narratives not really telling the story that we see, that we know, that we live. And in some kind of simple way, this is what these maps are supposed to do, which is provide an alternative narrative, um, and act really as tools to be able to, provide evidence also for that alternative narrative, um, and um, and allow for really a space that can, that can in a data-driven, evidence-driven way also, because this is what maps do, right? Um, yeah, maybe break through the noise and be able to give these very clear indications of, that can counter certain assumptions that people have because of, rehashed ideas that they're being bombarded with. Something as simple as a graph over time that shows, across the Lebanese border, um, how much the Israeli army was bombing Lebanon and how far from the border, daily or weekly versus Hezbollah, right? I mean, that snapshot gives you a very direct reading of the disproportionality, right? Very visible, at a glance, um, data driven. So it's it's this capability, I think, which makes the mapping tools very, very effective. And for me particularly, also they're interesting because I'm a big I want to always make the case for visual scholarship, and introducing another language, the visual language, the language of form, the language of design, that allows to kind of complement what we generally um, have to, I mean, the form of the information that we usually get. Um, and it's also something, there's something also that I think maps do that only maps can do, right? Which is be able to expose or identify or trace patterns across different layers, different variables, different indicators, that when that visualized together can really clarify certain relationships.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I said earlier, all of this is really to be able to take a measure, right, of a very particular landscape or territory or the world even, in a way that can be shared between people, but also shared between places
Yeah.
and shared across times. We think a lot about our mapping work as being an act of archiving, right?
Mhm.
And in that sense, there's yeah, a huge value in that, and yeah, uh, faith really in the ability of these visual tools to be records of a very particular moment.
And one of the things that we've seen also, you brought up media activism. There's obviously, to your point, this important aspect of always creating an archive of research for the future, because we don't know always in the moment how something is useful. It could be we find it's useful 10 years from now for something completely unexpected. Um, but to your point about media activism, also this question of advocacy, right? And accountability, the way that it's used in civil society. The lab, I know from personal experience, does work with organizations in Lebanon. Um, are there ways that you'd like to share, that the work is also that you're aware of, or that you have, that the is being conducted now, where the work is also being used for advocacy or accountability? I mean, we see so many of these various NGO reports come out. Obviously, there's international sort of legal cases underway as well.
We hope so. I mean, right now, the work, I'm not yet aware of a specific usage of their more recent conflict work, other than, of course, in reporting, in more journalistic spaces. It has been used, of course, but I think you're talking more specifically about the potential for this kind of evidential output to in fact be, I don't know, part of a court case, right? Um,
Perhaps, but I also know, like, I know that there is work on the ground, right, in Beirut with civil society organizations that are doing advocacy for various urban planning measures or lack thereof
yeah,
in the
and
city. And yeah,
um, we've definitely had, and I mean, not necessarily more recently. I mean, this also applies to the current situation, and also, you know, that past year and a half. But yeah, there are many cases of our work feeding directly into policy initiatives and supporting advocacy groups. I can think definitely of the example of the coast in Beirut, which at some point was very much a kind of a space for, you know, where these conversations were, I mean, it's a space around which these conversations were being had regarding public space, building law, access to natural features,
massive amounts
outdoor.
of privatization.
Yeah, of course. I mean, a neoliberal opening up the land for global investment, but also things like the culture of outdoor leisurely practices, historically and now relationship to nature. I mean, it was a very interesting case, and it had its successes. The movement to protect the Lebanese coast, the Beirut coast in particular, had its successes, and you know, that was partly. I mean, we know that the work that was done in the lab to map the shore, the different socio-spatial practices that happen there. And of course, to kind of expose really the changes in building law that enabled certain privatization
Yeah.
of certain parts to take place. We know that this helped. And we know that it was useful to these advocacy groups, and it was very much useful to the activists that were making a point, whether it is through their public demonstrations or their media appearances and so forth. More recently, and more specifically to what's happening now, we are in conversation at this point with Legal Agenda, which is an NGO that works on you know, all kinds of legal issues based in Lebanon, and that are interested in bringing a case specifically focused on South Beirut and, you know, the whole idea of herbicide and erasure, to bring a case against the state of Israel. And we are in conversation with Legal Agenda and a number of other working groups in Lebanon on the ground, you know, mobilizing our efforts to build that case. And part of that, of course, is the utilization of these um, visual snapshots, these mappings, these evidence-based, data-driven visualizations that can, in fact, hopefully contribute to that. We know that this has been happening. I can think of the work of forensic architecture, of course, as having been useful in that regard. The work of Lawrence Abu Hamdan, as well. So yeah, we are aware of this potentiality and are definitely you know, we're definitely seeing how much we can in fact, you know, utilize and and mobilize these outputs and this effort towards that goal.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Ahmed, for your time. I'll give
Thank
you
you.
any final thoughts you'd like to share.
No, just thank you very much for
All
this
talked out.
for this
Well,
talk.
thank you again.
It
Yeah,
was nice, and hopefully we'll catch up soon.
we will, and inshallah in Beirut in better times.
Yes, please do let us know when you're around,
I will.
and I will do the same if I'm
Yes, please.
in your part of the world.
Ahla sahla.
Of course. Thank you so much, Noor. Take good care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.